The wind howled through the Montana plains, rattling the old farmhouse windows. Kara Sullivan lay wide awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The silence of the night was suffocating, every creak of the floorboards below her, echoing like a warning. She hadn't been able to shake the uneasy feeling all week. It was like something was coming, something big. She pulled the blankets tight around her, trying to calm the rising tension in her chest. Beside her, her son, Luke, was fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the anxiety that had been eating at his mother for days. She glanced over at the clock on the nightstand. 2:03 a.m. Another sleepless night. Her instincts had been honed over years of military training, and those instincts told her something wasn't right. The sounds from outside had started, distant whispers, movements she couldn't quite place. Someone was watching. Kara sat up, her pulse quickening, her hand instinctively reaching under her pillow for the cold steel of her Beretta 9mm. But tonight, the feeling wasn't just about her own safety. It was about Luke. Kara swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness of the farmyard. Nothing. No movement, no cars, no shadows. Just the endless stretch of open land. Then, a faint sound. A rustling near the barn. Her breath hitched. There it was again. Kara's hand immediately went to the drawer next to her bed, pulling out a small flashlight and a set of night vision goggles. She slipped them over her eyes, scanning the area through the lens. The grainy green tint revealed nothing at first, just the empty fields and the distant shadows of the woods surrounding her property. But then she saw it. A dark figure, moving, near the barn, just beyond the line of the old fence posts. Her heart thudded in her chest. She knew that barn inside and out, and there was no reason anyone should be out there at this hour, especially not with the recent rumors floating around town, rumors of a gang operating in the area. And if they were here, it meant one thing. They were after something, and she couldn't let them take it. Kara moved swiftly, like a shadow, through the dim hallway of the farmhouse. She passed Luke's room, her gaze lingering on the sleeping form of her son. His peaceful face contrasted with the chaos churning inside her. She knew that no matter what happened, she would do anything to protect him. She reached the kitchen and pulled open the back door, stepping quietly onto the porch. The night air was cool, biting at her skin, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of her thoughts. The barn was only 100 yards away, and she moved toward it with the stealth of a seasoned operative, her boots crunching softly against the dirt path. Another movement. This time, closer. Kara's body tensed. Whoever it was, they were no amateur. She had dealt with enough enemies in the field to recognize the telltale signs. Someone trained, someone who knew how to move without making a sound. She crouched down, inching her way toward the barn's entrance, just as she saw the flicker of a flashlight beam pass across the barn door. Kara's hand went to the small of her back, pulling out a compact knife, the blade reflecting the faint light from the flashlight. She was ready. Just then, the sound of a vehicle engine revving from the far side of the property broke the silence, its lights flashing in the distance. Kara froze. The lights moved quickly toward the barn, and Kara's mind raced. It wasn't just a lone intruder. This was a group. She turned and sprinted silently toward the woods at the edge of the property, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to stay. Hidden, get to her position. Her military training kicked in, the years of sniper training, the countless hours spent learning to be invisible. Her thoughts flicked back to her time as a Green Beret, the sense of purpose she once had, the feeling of control. It had all been taken away when her husband, Jason, was killed in action. The loss was still raw, still lingering like a scar that wouldn't heal. But tonight, there was no time for grief. Kara ducked behind a large oak tree, crouching low. She could see the approaching vehicle now, a dark SUV, its headlights blinding against the dark sky. The car slowed as it neared the barn, and Kara's fingers tightened around the rifle slung over her shoulder. She was trained for this, but no one, not even the most experienced sniper, could ever be prepared for what was about to come. The SUV came to a halt and the men inside got out. They were moving quickly, efficiently, like a well-coordinated unit. Kara's eyes narrowed. She didn't know who they were, but she could guess their purpose. Her farm was nothing special, but the land was valuable, and these men clearly weren't here to make small talk. Her fingers gently pulled the rifle from its case. She clicked the safety off and raised the scope to her eye. The first man stepped into her line of sight. Kara held her breath, focusing on the steady beat of her heart. She wasn't going to let them take anything from her. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Kara exhaled slowly, steadying her breath. The cold barrel of her rifle was firm against her cheek, the familiar weight of it both comforting and unsettling. The man in her sights was oblivious to the danger that lay just behind the thick oak tree. The world was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the rhythmic sound of her heartbeats. She had always been good at this. Her time in the Green Berets had taught her how to blend into the surroundings, how to remain unseen. Even in the most dangerous of situations, it had made her lethal, efficient, and most importantly, it had kept her alive. But as she lined up the crosshairs on the first man's chest, something gnawed at her. She wasn't the same person she used to be. The woman who could take down a target without a second thought, who had been part of high-stakes operations, who had seen death up close and personal. That woman felt like a distant memory. Her fingers hovered over the trigger, and for a moment she thought about her son, Luke. The sharp sting of grief pierced her heart. Jason, her late husband, had been the reason she had joined the military in the first place. He had been the one to push her to join the Green Berets, to prove she was as strong as any man. He had been her rock, and she had lost him when the enemy ambushed their convoy in Afghanistan. The pain from that day had never fully left her. She hadn't allowed herself to grieve for him when it happened. She had to be strong for Luke. But every time she held that rifle in her hands, she couldn't help but remember the last words Jason had whispered to her before they parted ways on that fateful day. "Come back to me. For Luke. For us." Kara blinked away the memory, focusing on the task at hand. She had learned long ago that you couldn't afford to hesitate in moments like this. She couldn't afford to think about what had happened in the past. If she wanted to keep Luke safe, she had to act now. The man in her sights was shifting. His attention focused on the barn, oblivious to the sniper in the woods. He was about to open the barn door. Kara's finger tightened on the trigger. Her breath caught in her throat, her body going tense. But then, "Mom?" The soft voice broke, through the tension like a shot of adrenaline. Kara whipped her head to the side and saw Luke standing in the doorway of the farmhouse. His wide eyes were filled with confusion and fear. He had heard the commotion outside and come to find her. No, 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 Kara thought frantically. He was supposed to be in bed safe. The last thing she needed was for him to see her in the middle of this. "Luke, get inside," Kara hissed under her breath, her voice low but urgent. But Luke was frozen, standing there, staring at her with wide eyes. He had always been a curious kid, asking questions that sometimes made her want to pull her hair out. But now his gaze was filled with something else. It was fear. Fear for her, for what was happening, and the way she was acting. For a split second, Kara hesitated. The sniper's instinct to neutralize the threat was still there, still sharp. But as she looked at Luke, she knew that this wasn't the time. Not yet. With a final deliberate movement, she lowered the rifle and set it, down on the ground beside her. She turned quickly, sprinting toward the farmhouse with every ounce of speed her legs could carry. "Mom!" Luke shouted, running to meet her halfway. His hand reached out for hers, grasping it with the tight, desperate grip of someone who feared, losing the only person who mattered to him. Kara pulled him close, her arms wrapping around him protectively. She could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat against her chest. His fear was palpable, and for the first time in a long time she let herself feel the weight of it too. She had always been the one who protected him. But tonight, she wasn't. Sure, who would protect whom? "Luke, listen to me," Kara said, her voice calm but firm. "I need you to go inside, lock the door and stay there. Don't come out. Do you hear me?" Luke looked up at her with wide, scared eyes. "What's going on, Mom? Are we in danger?" Kara didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. There was no easy way to explain the danger they were facing, not without shattering the carefully built world she'd created for him since Jason's death. Instead, she dropped her voice to a whisper. "Go inside. Now. I'll be right behind you." Luke hesitated, his brow furrowed, but he finally nodded and turned back toward the house. Kara watched him go, her heart aching with the weight of what she was about to do. Turning back to the woods, Kara reached for her rifle again. Her instincts were screaming at her now, "Get ready, they're not going to stop." As she moved to reposition herself, she glanced once more at the farmhouse, at the small, warm light in Luke's room. Her son was safe, for now. But soon, that light might be the only thing left standing. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Kara crouched low behind the oak tree, her heart hammering in her chest. The silence of the night returned, thick and oppressive. Her senses were on high alert now, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as she scanned the darkness through her rifle's scope. Her breath was steady, but her mind was racing. Who were these men? What did they want with her farm? It didn't make sense. Her property wasn't worth much, not in a financial sense. But the way they moved, the urgency in their actions, told her this wasn't just some random robbery. They were professionals. Kara had dealt with threats before. In her time with the Green Berets, she had faced enemy forces in some of the most hostile places on Earth. She had learned to read the signs, to pick up on the smallest details that most people would miss. The way they moved, methodical, synchronized, was a dead giveaway. These men were no strangers to combat, and judging by the way they were scoping out her land, they were here for something specific. She heard them whispering to each other, their voices low but harsh, carried on the wind. Kara shifted, keeping herself concealed behind the tree, but she could make out some of their words. "Search the barn first. We'll move in after. Make sure the perimeter's clear. We don't want any surprises." Kara's fingers tightened. Around the rifle. She had no intention of letting them get any closer to what was hers, her farm, her land, and most importantly, her son. But she had to wait. Patience was key. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the rising anxiety in her chest. It wasn't the time to make a move yet. These men weren't even aware she was watching. That gave her the advantage. Her mind drifted back to the years she had spent in the military, to the brutal training that had shaped her. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago. Since Jason's death, she had tried to move on, tried to live a quiet life for Luke, to give him some semblance of normalcy. But the truth was, she'd always been ready for a fight. Her time as a sniper had taught her that peace was often fleeting, and danger could strike when you least expected it. No more distractions, she told herself. Focus on the here and now. The group of men had reached the barn. Kara could see their shadows moving in the dim light, each of them scanning the area, checking for any signs of movement. She knew that barn better than anyone, and she had no doubt that it was the first place they would check. Her mind raced through the options. There was a cache of weapons hidden in the barn, a precaution she'd set up after the rumors about the gang started circulating. It was just a few handguns and a couple of shotguns, nothing extraordinary but enough to defend herself if the worst came to pass. But the question was, would they find it? Kara's grip tightened around the stock of her rifle. If they did, she didn't even want to finish the thought. The men moved closer to the barn's entrance and Kara's pulse quickened. One of them was about to enter. Her instincts screamed at her to act, to take the shot before they could get any closer, but she held back. The last thing she needed was for them to hear a gunshot. If they realized she was here, they would be ready for her. She bit down on her lower lip, watching through the scope as the man slowly approached the barn door. He reached for the handle. His fingers brushed it lightly, testing the resistance of the old wood. No. Not yet. Wait. Kara's mind raced as she calculated the exact moment she would need to pull the trigger. The man paused, his head swiveling around as if sensing something, his gaze scanning the darkened fields. Kara held her breath, her finger hovering just over the trigger, but he didn't see her. He can't see me. Kara let out a slow, controlled breath, trying to steady her nerves. She couldn't afford to be impulsive. In moments like this, every second counted. One wrong move could expose her position, and if that happened, she wouldn't have a chance. The man stepped back from the barn, motioning to the others. They converged on the entrance, ready to move inside. Kara had a brief moment to act, and her mind locked onto the target. The barrel of her rifle was steady. Her eyes never left the man's silhouette as he entered the barn, but just before she could take the shot, the sound of a vehicle engine roaring to life broke through the stillness of the night. Kara froze. Vehicle was coming from the same direction as the men, toward the barn. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. Her first thought was that it was more of them, reinforcements arriving to make their move. But then the vehicle's headlights cut through the trees, and the sound grew louder. She couldn't see the vehicle yet, but it was close, too close. Kara's eyes darted between the barn and the approaching vehicle, weighing her options. Should she take the shot now, or should she deal with the new threat first? She could hear the engine grow louder. The men were moving faster now, entering the barn at a frantic pace, as if they realized they were running out of time. They were on edge, and that made Kara's job easier. She glanced back toward the farmhouse. Luke was still inside, likely unaware of how close danger had come, but there was no time to check on him now. Kara's focus was razor-sharp. Her instincts told her that the men were about to make a mistake, and when they did, she would be ready. Kara's heart raced as the sound of the engine drew nearer. The headlights sliced through the darkness, growing brighter by the second. She could hear the gravel crunching beneath the tires, the soft hiss of the vehicle's suspension adjusting to the uneven ground. Whoever was in that car was moving fast, and they were coming straight toward the barn. She glanced at the men near the entrance. They were distracted, their attention focused on the barn and whatever was inside. They were rushing, careless. This was her moment. Her fingers tightened around the rifle again, aligning the crosshairs with the head of the man closest to the barn door. Just one clean shot, and he'd be down. The others wouldn't have time to react. But the vehicle was now just 50 yards away, and her window of opportunity was closing fast. She had to make a choice. Kara's mind spun. If she took the shot now, the vehicle might pull up just as the gunshot echoed through the night. The men would be alerted, and they'd go into full defensive mode. On the other hand, if she waited, and the vehicle turned out to be more of the gang's reinforcements, she might lose the advantage entirely. Her eyes flicked between the approaching vehicle and the men at the barn. The engine was almost deafening now. Too close. Her decision was made in a split second. She pulled back from the rifle and darted toward the edge of the property, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the tall grass. The vehicle's headlights illuminated the barn now, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. Kara knew that once the vehicle came into view, there would be no going back. Her muscles screamed in protest as she sprinted, her breath shallow and controlled. She pushed her body harder, faster. The barn was just ahead, but she needed to get to a better vantage point. The barn would offer some cover, but there were too many open spaces between her and the barn to risk being exposed. The vehicle's headlights were almost on top of her now. She ducked behind a small cluster of trees, her heart hammering in her chest. From here she could see the vehicle clearly. It was a black SUV, the kind commonly used by gangs. The windows were tinted, but the silhouette of the driver was visible in the front seat. There were no markings on the vehicle, no insignia, nothing to indicate who these people were, but everything about it screamed trouble. The vehicle slowed, coming to a stop near the barn. The engine cut off and the lights dimmed. Kara stayed perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. The moment was tense, suffocating as she waited for the next move. Two men climbed out of the vehicle, their movements precise and deliberate. They were armed, each with a weapon strapped to their chest. The first man was tall, muscular, with a scar running down the side of his face. He looked around quickly, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The second man, shorter but stockier, carried a heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder. They exchanged a few quiet words, their voices too soft for Kara to hear from her position. But one thing was clear. These men knew what they were doing. They weren't here for a casual robbery, they had a purpose. The door to the barn creaked open, and the first man started walking toward it. Kara's mind raced. They were going in. But what were they after? The second man lingered by the SUV, his eyes flicking around nervously. Kara's hand moved to her side, ready to pull out her pistol if needed. But the moment she was dreading came too quickly. A loud shout echoed from inside the barn. "Clear," a voice yelled. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, boots scraping against the wooden floor. The men inside the barn were already moving into position, preparing for something. Kara's heart skipped a beat. They were too fast. Whatever they were looking for, they were getting closer to finding it. And if they did, everything she had worked to protect, the farm, the weapons, her and Luke's future, could be destroyed in an instant. "Move in," the man from the SUV shouted. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the urgency. The two men started toward the barn, and Kara's mind immediately snapped into action. This was it. She couldn't wait any longer. There were too many of them now, too much risk. She needed to eliminate the threat before it was too late. Kara quickly sprinted for cover behind the barn, keeping to the shadows as she moved. The tall grass rustled underfoot, but she didn't stop. She knew the terrain better than they did. The barn was old, filled with narrow corridors and hiding spots she could use to her advantage. The man with the scar was the first to reach the barn's doorway. He stopped, hesitating for a brief moment, his hand resting on the wooden frame. His eyes narrowed as if he sensed something was off. Kara didn't waste any time. She lined up her shot again, this time with the man's head in her sights. A soft exhale. Focus. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder as the shot rang out, a crack of thunder in the otherwise silent night. The man with the scar collapsed immediately, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. The other man, the stockier one, whipped around, eyes wide with shock. He grabbed for his weapon, but it was too late. Kara was already in motion, her body moving with fluid precision. She darted toward the other side of the barn, using the shadows for cover as she reloaded her rifle. More footsteps, more men. It was only a matter of time before they figured out where she was. The sound of the shot still echoed in the night air, reverberating through the trees and rattling the barn walls. Kara's heart pounded in her chest, but her training took over. She moved with precision, her body already calculating the next steps even as her mind processed what had just happened. The man with the scar was down, but the remaining thug was already retreating to cover. Kara's rifle stayed steady in her hands, her focus razor-sharp. The stockier man dove behind the old woodpile near the barn, the heavy thud of his body hitting the ground barely audible over the wind. But his panic was clear. He knows someone is watching now, he knows. Kara's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to be a firefight, this wasn't supposed to be a standoff. She had been hoping to neutralize the threat quietly, efficiently. But now, with one man down and the others undoubtedly hearing the shot, everything had changed. The element of surprise was gone. She didn't have much time. The others would be close. The stockier man peeked around the corner of the woodpile, and Kara took a calculated risk. Now her finger squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The man jerked back, his body crumpling to the ground as the bullet found its mark. His weapon slipped from his hands, falling uselessly to the dirt. Kara didn't wait to see if he was truly dead. She knew how to read the signs, when the fight was over, when there was no more threat. And right now she could sense that this part of the battle was done. But there was no time to relax. Her ears strained to hear any sign of movement from the woods, footsteps, voices, anything. The men who had been with them, had they already made their way to the barn? She needed to know their positions before they could make a counter-move. Kara moved quickly, darting into the shadow of the barn, her body low and tense. Her movements were precise, calculated. She knew the terrain better than anyone, and she used that knowledge to her advantage. The barn, the land around it, the trees lining the perimeter, they were all her domain. She paused for a moment, listening. Her breathing was steady, but the adrenaline was still running high in her bloodstream. Every muscle in her body screamed for action, but her mind kept her sharp, kept her patient. And then she heard it, a vehicle. Another SUV. Kara's stomach dropped. This wasn't good. There had been no way for her to know how many of them were out there, how many vehicles were involved. The gang she had been hearing rumors about was big, bigger than she'd imagined. The headlights of the second vehicle cut through the trees, just like the first one had. But this time, there were no surprises. She had heard the engine before. The vehicle even came into view. She'd heard the tires on gravel. The men weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. Kara's mind raced. More men, more firepower. If she didn't get Luke out of there soon, they'd be trapped. She glanced over her shoulder toward the farmhouse. The light in Luke's room was still on. He wasn't in bed. He was still awake. He's still safe. The thought didn't reassure her as much as she wanted it to. He could be seen from the window. He could be in the line of fire if they got close enough. Kara bit her lip, fighting back the panic creeping into her chest. The second SUV pulled up near the barn, its tires crunching loudly on the gravel. The engine cut off, and the air was filled with that tense silence again. She knew they were here. They were waiting for something. Waiting for her. Kara had no doubt now that the men knew someone was picking them off, but they didn't know exactly where she was. She had the advantage, but the numbers were against her, with the barn surrounded, and more men arriving. She knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. Her training kicked in again. She needed a plan, a way to control the flow of this confrontation. She couldn't keep picking them off one by one, not with Luke in danger. Kara's eyes scanned the perimeter. She needed to get to the farmhouse and get Luke out. It was risky, but there was no other option. She had to move quickly, without hesitation. If she stayed here too long, the situation would spiral out of control. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and sprinted toward the barn's back door. The wind howled as she ran, her boots pounding against the ground, her breath coming in quick bursts. She was fast, but her thoughts were a blur. Luke. Get to Luke. As she reached the barn door, she paused for a moment to gather her bearings. She could hear the men outside. Footsteps, muffled voices, the sound of something heavy being moved. They were getting closer. Kara took a deep breath and pushed the barn door open, slipping inside. The barn was dim, the scent of hay and dust thick in the air. She moved quickly toward the back, checking her surroundings for any signs of movement. The place was mostly empty, save for a few crates and the hidden weapons cache she'd set up. For emergencies, but it wasn't the weapons she needed now. It was time to get Luke and get out. Kara's heart pounded in her chest as she darted through the barn. The old wooden beams creaked above her, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual in the dim light. Every footstep echoed in the silence, reminding her of just how much danger she and Luke were in. Her mind was laser-focused, her every action driven by the thought of getting to him. Luke. She didn't stop to think about the men outside, the ones she'd already neutralized. She couldn't afford to. They were a threat that was already dealt with, but there were more coming. More cars, more weapons. This was only the beginning. Kara knew that if she didn't act fast, they'd both be trapped in this nightmare. The farmhouse was just a short distance away, and she could see the faint glow of light through the window of Luke's room. It was still on, but the longer she waited, the more time they had to make their move. She had to hurry. Kara pushed open the back door of the barn, just enough to peer through the crack. The SUV was parked in the middle of the yard, and the men outside were still moving around, looking for signs of movement. From what she could tell, they hadn't yet realized exactly where she was. That gave her a slim window of opportunity, but it was rapidly closing. She ducked low, moving swiftly across the barnyard toward the farmhouse. The tall grass brushed against her boots, and she kept her body low to the ground, the shadows offering what little cover there was. Every step felt like an eternity. She could feel the eyes of the world on her. As she approached the back of the farmhouse, Kara's mind raced through her options. She didn't know how many men were left. She didn't know how many were still on the move. But what she did know was that if they were getting closer, they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. She paused at the back door of the farmhouse, hearing nothing but the wind and the distant sounds of the men still moving around the barn. Kara's breath was steady, but her pulse was quick. Luke. She pushed open the door slowly, wincing as the old hinges squeaked in protest. But the sound wasn't enough to alert anyone. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. She crept through the kitchen, keeping her movements minimal and calculated. There was no room for error now. She couldn't afford to make noise. Her eyes flicked toward the stairs. Luke's room was upstairs. She could hear the faint hum of his fan coming from the hallway, his usual sound when he was awake at night. But it was almost too quiet. Kara's breath caught in her throat as she crept up the stairs. The light in his room was still on, casting a soft glow from under the door. She stopped just outside his room, pressing her ear to the door for any sign. Of movement. Nothing. Good, he's still there. She pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. Luke was sitting on his bed, his back to the door, his head buried in a book. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Luke," she whispered softly, not wanting to startle him. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Mum?" Kara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room quickly. It was just as she'd left it, a typical kid's room, cluttered with toys and books scattered across the floor. But now, there was a sense of unease in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Listen to me, sweetheart," Kara said, her voice urgent. "We need to leave right now. There are men outside and they're looking for us." Luke's face went pale. "What's happening? Why are they here?" Kara quickly moved to his side, kneeling beside him. She grabbed his hands in hers, looking him in the eyes. "I don't have all the answers, Luke, but right now we need to get out of here. We're in danger and I'm not going to let anything happen to you, okay?" He nodded, but his face was still filled with confusion and fear. Kara gently pulled him to his feet. She could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had felt when she first saw the men outside. But she couldn't afford to show him her own fear. "We're going to be okay," she said firmly, even though she didn't know if that was true. She grabbed a small backpack from the corner of the room, stuffing it with a few essentials, clothes, food, a flashlight. She didn't have time to think about anything else. There was no way they could survive if they didn't leave. As Kara zipped up the bag, Luke turned toward the window. "Are they out there?" Kara's heart stopped for a second, and her gaze snapped to the window. The curtains were drawn, but she could see shadows moving outside near the barn. There were more of them. She grabbed Luke's hand tightly. "We need to go. Now." They moved quickly through the hallway, past the kitchen, and toward the back door. Kara's eyes stayed glued to the yard outside. The men hadn't reached the house yet, but she knew they were close. The second SUV had to be parked somewhere nearby, and it was only a matter of time before they started searching the farmhouse. As she opened the back door, she glanced at Luke, his face pale with fear but determined. They had to move quickly. The woods behind the house were their best shot. Kara had a few hidden paths she'd used during her training, ones that no one else knew about. They'd take those paths, get as far as possible, and hope the men didn't find them. As they stepped outside, the door creaked loudly. Kara's stomach churned. That sound. It could be enough to give them away. She held Luke's hand tighter and started running. She had no choice now. The crunch of Kara's boots against the dry ground was the only sound she could hear as she sprinted through the backyard, pulling Luke along with her. The night air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though it was closing in on her with every step. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her focus remained sharp. She couldn't afford to let her mind wander. Focus. Move fast. Don't look back. Behind them, the farmhouse was dark, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The men wouldn't take long to realize that she and Luke were missing. The vehicles outside would be the first place they'd check. She had to get them both out of sight and into the woods before they did. She glanced over her shoulder as they neared the tree line, her breath shallow and fast. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure emerge from the edge of the barn. It was just a shadow, too quick to make out details, but it sent a wave of panic through her. They were getting closer. Kara's pulse quickened. She pushed Luke ahead of her, her hand gripping his firmly. "Keep running. Don't stop. Just keep going." Luke nodded, his face pale but determined. He might have been scared, but he trusted his mother, and that was all that mattered right now. Kara needed him to stay focused. They had to stay ahead of whoever was out there, and that meant not slowing down for anything. The woods were just ahead, dense and dark, the perfect cover for someone who knew how to move through it. Kara had learned the terrain well during her time in the service. This wasn't just any forest. She had built these trails herself, pathways she'd carved into the land long ago, and they would lead them deep into the mountains, far from anyone who might be looking for them. They reached the tree line, and Kara yanked Luke off to the side, behind a cluster of thick trees. She crouched low, her breathing steady but rapid. She didn't want to risk being seen, even in the darkness. She looked at Luke, his eyes wide with fear. "You okay?" "I'm okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "Are we safe here?" Kara glanced back toward the farmhouse, then at the moonlit expanse of the woods. "For now, but we have to keep moving. They'll come looking for us soon. We can't stop here for long." Without waiting for a response, she stood up, keeping low to the ground. Her hand gripped Luke's, and together they moved deeper into the woods, following the narrow trail that snaked through the trees. The path was rough, barely wide enough for two people, but it was a familiar route to Kara. She knew every twist and turn, every rock and dip in the ground. For the next few minutes, the only sounds were their hurried footsteps and the wind rustling through the branches. Kara's mind was racing. What was their next move? She needed to get to a safe house, a place where they could hide out until she figured out how to deal with the men who had come to her farm, the ones who were hunting them. But there was no time to waste thinking too far ahead. One step at a time. Kara glanced over at Luke, who was staying close behind her. He looked up at her, his face full of trust and concern. She could feel his fear, but she couldn't let him see hers. She had to be strong for him. "We're going to be okay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I promise you." Luke didn't say anything, but he gave her a small nod, his hand tightening around hers. That was enough. They kept moving, silently weaving through the trees, Kara's senses on high alert. She couldn't afford to let her guard down for even a second. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of a twig underfoot, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Every step felt like a warning. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of the farmhouse began to fade, but Kara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Her instincts told her someone was out there, maybe more than one. She couldn't be sure, but she knew she couldn't let them catch up. They reached a small clearing and Kara paused, pulling Luke down beside her. She flattened herself against a large boulder, trying to remain as still as possible. Her breath came in short bursts as she listened carefully for any sign of movement. She could hear nothing. Maybe they hadn't noticed they'd escaped yet, but Kara knew better than to trust silence. She had been trained to detect the slightest noise, the smallest shift in the wind. And in that moment, as the night air hung heavy around them, she thought she heard something, a soft rustling, faint but distinct. She glanced at Luke, his wide eyes reflecting the same fear she felt. He didn't say anything, but he could tell. "Stay. Quiet," she whispered. "Do exactly what I do." Luke nodded again, his face set with determination. He was frightened, yes, but he was following her lead, and that was all she needed right now. Kara reached for the small pocket knife at her belt. It wasn't much, but it would have to do if things went south. She knew she couldn't outrun all of them, not with Luke in tow, but she could fight. She had always known how to fight. Stay hidden. Stay smart. They moved again, slowly, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The rustling sound grew closer now, unmistakable. Kara's muscles tensed. She glanced over at Luke, who was still focused on her every movement. He was ready to follow her lead. They came to a narrow path that veered off to the left. It was just wide enough for them to fit through, a tight squeeze between trees and thick underbrush. Kara looked down at Luke one last time. "We'll go. This way. Quietly. Stay close." They slipped into the trail, moving as silently as they could. The darkness was their ally now. If they stayed hidden, maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of the woods before the men realized what was happening. But even as she pushed forward, Kara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead of them. She had no idea how many men there were, or how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted, but she wasn't about to let them take her son, not without a fight. The woods felt endless. The trees loomed above them, their branches, swaying gently in the night breeze, creating a canopy of shadows that seemed to swallow them whole. Kara kept her steps light and quick, each one calculated. She couldn't afford to make a sound that might give them away. Luke was right beside her, his hand gripped tightly in hers. She could feel the heat of his small fingers wrapped around her own. His breath was shallow, his eyes darting around with the same alertness that Kara had learned to adopt over the years. They had to keep moving. The farther they got from the farmhouse, the better. If they could make it to the hidden cabin up ahead, they might be able to regroup, plan, and find a way to deal with the situation. But Kara's mind was far from the cabin. She was thinking about the men. How many were out there? How much longer? Before they realized she and Luke had escaped, they had to act fast. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, and for a moment the sound almost comforted her. It reminded her of the times she used to come out here alone, just to clear her mind or think things through. But tonight, that peacefulness felt far away. Everything felt wrong. She stopped, crouching behind a large boulder at the edge of a small clearing. Kara pulled Luke down next to her, pressing him close to the ground, and held her breath. There was something different in the air, a new sense of urgency. They were getting closer. Kara's heart raced as she listened intently. There was no mistaking it now. Footsteps. Not far behind them, the sound of crunching leaves and twigs underfoot, just out of view but close enough that they might hear it if they weren't careful. She waited, frozen. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were following them. Kara looked down at Luke. His face was pale, but his eyes were wide and alert. He was scared, but he wasn't panicking. She could see the quiet resolve in him, the same strength that had carried her through countless missions. She couldn't let anything happen to him. Focus. Kara's mind worked quickly. There wasn't enough cover ahead, and their path was too narrow. The men wouldn't have trouble spotting them in the open. She needed to get them out of sight and fast. She looked to the left, where a dense thicket of bushes provided a potential escape route. Kara motioned for Luke to follow, and without a word, they slipped through the underbrush, keeping low. Each step was careful, deliberate, as they made their way deeper into the woods, away from the sound of the men's footsteps. They moved slowly, trying not to make any noise. The leaves beneath their feet seemed to crackle with every movement. But Kara was careful. She knew how to move through the wilderness quietly, and she was teaching Luke the same. They couldn't afford to alert anyone to their position. The night air was growing colder, and Kara felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just the temperature. Something about this entire situation felt off. The men were getting closer, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded in a certain direction. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. The darkness in the woods made it hard to tell if they were being followed, but Kara trusted her instincts. We're close, too close. Mom, do you think they know where we are? Luke's voice was a quiet whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Kara didn't answer right away. Her mind raced, but she didn't want to lie to him. She couldn't afford to. They might, but we're not going to let them catch us. Luke nodded, his face set with determination. He was more mature than she had ever given him credit for. She had to admit, seeing him like this made her heart swell with pride, but the pride didn't last long. There was still work to be done, and time was running out. Kara led him through the thicket, moving farther from the clearing, deeper into the woods. The trail ahead was more difficult to navigate, but it was the best option. It was a path she had used before, one that would take them away from the farmhouse and the men chasing them. But the deeper they went, the more Kara could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, had all gone silent. The only thing she could hear now was the pounding of her own heart, and then a sound, footsteps, not just one set, but multiple. Her blood ran cold. They weren't just following her anymore. They were surrounding her. She motioned for Luke to stop and crouch low. Her hand shot to her rifle, but she kept it hidden beneath the brush. She didn't want to reveal her position unless she had to. Her breath was shallow as she listened closely. There were at least 3 sets of footsteps, moving slowly through the woods, methodical. They were trying to cut them off. Kara's mind spun. How had they found them? Had they anticipated her path, or had they been tracking her all along? She peeked through the leaves, her eyes scanning the area around them. Nothing yet, but she could feel them closing in. They were getting closer. She pulled Luke closer to her, whispering urgently, "We need to move now." But before she could stand, a voice broke the silence. "You're not going anywhere, lady." Kara's blood froze. The voice came from somewhere to her right, just beyond the thicket. She could hear the sound of a branch snapping underfoot, followed by the unmistakable rustle of someone moving through the woods. The men had found them. Kara's heart was pounding in her chest, a mix of adrenaline and dread surging through her veins. She had always been able to count on her instincts, but this time she wasn't so sure. They were too close. The men had already surrounded them, and there was no way out unless they made a move now. Kara's fingers tightened around her rifle. She didn't want to shoot unless absolutely necessary, but she would do whatever it took to protect Luke. She kept her breathing shallow, her eyes scanning the dense brush around them, looking for any sign of movement. The voice that had spoken was deeper, gruff, definitely one of the men who had come to her farm. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was close. Too close. "Listen, lady," the voice came again, low and menacing. "We don't want to hurt you or your kid, but you're not getting away." Kara gritted her teeth, trying to keep her composure. She had faced far worse than this in her past. She could handle it. Luke was silent beside her, his small hand clutching hers tightly. He was scared, she could tell, but he didn't make a sound. He was learning to be still, to wait for his mother's lead. Stay calm. Kara slowly pulled him closer, motioning for him to stay down. She needed time to think, to figure out a way out of this. The men were spread out, making it almost impossible to know where they were. But one thing was certain: if they stayed in this spot, they were dead. The voice spoke again, but this time it was accompanied by the sound of crunching leaves, indicating the man was moving closer. "You're cornered, lady. No use hiding. Come out and maybe we'll let you both go." Kara's mind raced. The men were trying to bluff their way into getting her to surrender, but Kara wasn't the type to give up without a fight. She had to outsmart them. Then she remembered the ravine. It was a bit of a risk, but if she could lead them in the opposite direction, maybe they could buy themselves enough time to get to safety. She had been through that ravine 100 times, and though it was narrow and difficult to navigate, it was their best shot. Kara grabbed Luke's hand, pressing her finger to her lips, signaling for him to be silent. She had to move fast. Without warning, she darted to her right, pulling Luke along with her. She didn't look back, but she heard the men curse as they realized she was making a run for it. The underbrush scratched at her legs as she pushed forward, leading Luke through the dense trees and toward the ravine. Her heart hammered in her chest, and every instinct told her to stop and turn around to fight, but she knew they needed to move now. They reached the ravine within minutes, and Kara paused at the edge, scanning the area. The drop was steep, but not impossible to navigate. If they were careful, they could make it down and out of sight. She took a deep breath. "You ready, Luke?" Luke didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, trusting his mother's judgment. Kara grabbed a nearby branch, testing its strength before using it to lower herself down. Luke followed her, gripping onto her tightly as they made their descent. The steep incline made every movement slow and cautious, but Kara kept her focus, guiding them both downward. Just as they were nearly halfway down, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above them. They had caught up. Her heart skipped. Her beat. They were getting too close, and the ravine wasn't going to protect them for long. "Mom, they're coming," Luke whispered, his voice filled with panic. "Shh, stay quiet," Kara urged, trying to stay calm. She could feel her grip slipping slightly as she tried to maintain balance on the uneven rocks. The footsteps grew louder, and Kara's heart was racing. They had to hurry. Finally, she reached the bottom, pulling Luke down with her. The bottom of the ravine was a narrow, rocky creek bed, overgrown with weeds and thick vegetation. They were hidden now, but it was only a matter of time before the men realized where they had gone. "Stay low," Kara instructed as she crouched down, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "We're not out of this yet." They stayed still for a moment, the only sound the rushing of water somewhere further down the creek. Kara's ears were straining, listening for any sign of the men above. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the top of the ravine. One of the men had slipped, and the sound sent a jolt of fear through Kara. She pulled Luke closer to her, holding her breath as the footsteps grew louder again. She knew it wouldn't be long before they figured out where they had gone. They had to move. Kara took a deep breath. They weren't out of danger yet. The ravine might have bought them a little time, but the men would eventually figure it out. And when they did, Kara knew the real fight would begin. She squeezed Luke's hand and began moving again, leading him along the narrow creek bed, keeping to the shadows. The water was cold beneath her feet, the rocks slippery, but she pushed forward. They couldn't afford to stop now. Each step felt like a countdown. The men weren't far behind. "Stay close, Luke, and don't make a sound," Kara whispered, her voice firm but soft. The boy nodded, his eyes wide, filled with a mix of fear and trust. He didn't speak, but Kara knew he understood. They had no choice now. They had to run, and they had to be smarter than the men who were hunting them. This was just the beginning. The sound of rushing water echoed through the ravine, masking their footsteps as Kara and Luke moved deeper into the creek bed. Kara kept her eyes ahead, every muscle in her body tense, waiting for the inevitable. She knew the men weren't far behind. They'd catch up soon enough. Her only hope was to keep moving faster than they could track her. The four dense trees above them created a blanket of darkness, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But it worked to their advantage. The cover of night was their ally. The shadows provided a brief moment of safety, but Kara knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to find a way to lose them. "Mom, how far do we have to go?" Luke whispered, his small voice trembling with exhaustion. He was holding up well, but even Kara could tell that the strain of running, the fear and the cold water were taking their toll on him. "We're almost there," Kara answered, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. She had hoped the ravine would lead them to a clearing where they could rest, but the path was growing narrower and more treacherous. There was no telling where it would end. The water was now up to her knees, and the rocks beneath them grew slippery. Every step felt like it took twice the effort, the jagged edges of the stones threatening to trip her up. But she kept going, gripping Luke's hand tightly as he stumbled beside her. The last thing she needed was for him to fall behind. They were almost through the worst of it when Kara heard the unmistakable crack of a twig breaking overhead. The men were getting closer. Kara's heart skipped a beat. They were closing in. She pulled Luke to the side of the creek, pressing him against the jagged rock wall, hiding them in the shadows. She crouched low, her breath shallow, listening carefully for any sounds of movement. The footsteps above them were unmistakable now, heavy, deliberate. They were getting closer. Kara's mind raced. She couldn't let them catch up. Not now. She had to get Luke to safety. She turned to him, her face inches from his. "Listen to me, Luke. Stay as quiet as you can. I need to check something, but you can't move. Do you understand?" Luke nodded, his wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. His grip on her hand tightened, but he didn't speak. He understood what she needed him to do. Kara slowly eased herself out of the creek bed, careful to avoid making a sound. She crawled up the embankment to get a better look at their pursuers. The last thing she needed was to be caught off guard, peering. Through the underbrush, she spotted movement through the trees. Two of the men walking slowly down the ravine, flashlights cutting through the darkness. She couldn't make out their faces, but she could hear their voices as they argued in low tones. "They're not far behind," one of them muttered. "She's not going to get far in this water. Just keep moving." Kara's stomach tightened. They were right. If she kept going, the creek would lead them to an open field. There was nowhere to hide in the field. They would be vulnerable there. She had to find a way to turn them around, buy them more time. Her hand instinctively went to her rifle, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She couldn't make a stand here. Not yet. Not unless she had no other choice. Kara's eyes flicked to Luke, still hidden behind the rocks. He was staying put as instructed. For a moment, Kara allowed herself to feel a flash of pride. He was stronger than she realized. But there was no time to dwell on that. The men would be on them soon. She had one chance. With a deep breath, Kara rose to her feet as quietly as possible, crouching low behind a large boulder. Her fingers tightened around her rifle, but she didn't take aim just yet. She needed a distraction, something to draw the men away from their path. Kara's eyes scanned the area, searching for anything that could help. Her gaze settled on, say, a cluster of dry branches and twigs piled up near the edge of the ravine. It was a risk, but it could work. Without wasting another second, Kara carefully pulled the branches together, arranging them in a way that would create a loud crack when triggered. She had a feeling that the men would be focused on the sound rather than the direction. Kara set the trap and moved back into the shadows, hoping the sound would be loud enough to mislead them. She crouched beside a tree, watching the men carefully. It didn't take long. As soon as the men reached the spot where she had set the trap, one of them stepped on the dry twigs, causing them to snap loudly in the otherwise silent night. What the? One of the men barked, spinning around to face the noise. The other one quickly raised his flashlight, scanning the area. What was that? The distraction worked. The two men were now focused on the sound, giving Kara the opening she needed. She took Luke's hand and quietly began moving again, pushing through the dense underbrush. They had a few moments before the men realized their mistake. They needed to make them count. Kara pushed Luke forward, leading him deeper into the woods, away from the ravine and into the thick trees. She could still hear the men above them, cursing and searching for her, but she knew she had bought herself a little time. "We're almost there," Kara whispered to Luke, though she didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. She could feel the weight of the rifle on her back, the constant reminder that the fight wasn't over, but for now they were still alive. Kara knew they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Kara's legs ached as she moved swiftly through the forest, Luke's small hand tightly clutching hers. The night was growing colder, and the air felt thick with tension. They hadn't stopped moving for what felt like hours, but Kara knew they couldn't afford to. Every second they spent lingering was another second the men could close in on them. Her breathing was shallow, her body instinctively reacting to the fear and urgency of the situation. She had faced danger before, but never like this. The men hunting them weren't just strangers. They were ruthless, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Kara glanced over at Luke. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't make a sound. He was holding it together, just like his mother had taught him. Stay quiet, stay calm. The same lessons that had kept her alive through the darkest days of her past were now what would keep him alive. The trees seemed to close in around them, the underbrush thickening with every step they took. Kara knew the forest well, but she had never pushed herself or Luke so far before. They needed shelter, a place to hide, but every option seemed too risky. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the night air, the unmistakable crunch of a branch snapping. Kara froze, her heart skipping a beat. They were too close. "Mom." "I'm scared," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. His fear was palpable, and Kara could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She crouched down, pulling him close, her face serious but gentle. "Listen to me, Luke, we're going to be okay, but I need you to stay quiet and stay with me. No matter what happens, you trust me, all right?" Luke nodded, his small shoulders trembling as he tried to hold back the tears. "I trust you, Mum." Kara gave him a reassuring smile, though her heart was heavy with the weight of what they were facing. She could hear the men's voices now growing louder. They were getting closer. There was no time left to waste. Kara knew they had to move again, but this time they needed to find a place to hunker down. She wasn't going to risk another chase. If the men found them again, they wouldn't get away so easily. Without a word, Kara took Luke's hand and guided him through the thick woods. Her mind raced, calculating their next move, their next hiding spot. There was an old hunting cabin nearby, one that she had used when she was younger, though it had fallen into disrepair. It wasn't much, but it was the best chance they had. She pulled Luke closer as they navigated the thick trees, their movements now even more cautious. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the forest, every crack of a twig beneath their Feet felt like it could betray them to the men just a few steps behind. Kara's senses were on high alert. They couldn't stop yet. They reached the cabin just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the forest. The cabin was small, barely more than a shack, but it would provide some cover. Kara pushed, opened the rotting door, the hinges creaking loudly in protest. She winced but kept moving, ushering Luke inside. Once inside, Kara quickly shut the door behind them, the sound of the wind howling outside, the only noise breaking the silence. The cabin smelled musty, but it was a safe place, at least for now. Kara turned to Luke, kneeling in front of him. "We're going to stay here for a while, but we can't stay too long. We need to keep moving soon, okay?" Luke nodded, his face pale but relieved to be out of the open. He sat down on the cold floor, hugging his knees to his chest. Kara sat down beside him, her mind racing. She could still hear the men's voices faintly in the distance, though they were no longer pursuing them directly. For now, they were safe. But the men would be relentless. They would continue searching until they found them, and Kara knew that meant they couldn't rest for long. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. She had been trained for situations like this, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting Luke. He was everything. Kara stood up, walking to the small window at the back of the cabin. She peered through the cracks in the wooden walls, scanning the area. The forest was still, the morning fog thickening the landscape. There was no sign of the men. At least, not yet. But she knew they wouldn't give up, not after all this. She turned back to Luke, who was now staring at the floor, lost in thought. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling beside him again. "You okay?" Luke looked up at her, his big eyes filled with concern. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" Kara hesitated, her heart aching as she looked at her son. She couldn't lie to him. "We're going to be fine, Luke," she said, her voice steady even though doubt gnawed at her. "I won't let anything happen to you." Luke's face softened, and for the first time that night he gave her a small tentative smile. Kara smiled back, but the weight of the situation didn't leave her. They were far from safe. She knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. The men would catch their trail soon enough, and then they'd have to run again. This was just a brief moment of respite. They needed a plan. Kara turned to the small table in the corner of the cabin, where a few old maps lay scattered. She hadn't used these maps in years, but they might still be useful. She needed to get them out of the woods, away from the men, and to safety. But how? She pulled the maps closer, tracing the lines with her finger, already thinking several steps ahead. She had to stay one step ahead of them, and if that meant running through the night, so be it. For Luke, she would do anything. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind against the walls. Kara studied the maps laid out on the table, tracing routes with her fingers, trying to pinpoint the safest way out of the woods. Her mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, none of them offering a perfect solution. There were no guarantees in this life, especially not when people like the men who were hunting them were involved. Kara's thoughts kept drifting back to Luke. He was sitting cross-legged in the corner, staring into space. His quietness was unsettling. She had seen him like this before, after tough moments, his way of processing what was happening around him. He wasn't just a scared little boy anymore. He was becoming someone who could understand the gravity of their situation, but she hated seeing him like this. She hated that he had to grow up so quickly. Kara snapped herself out of her thoughts and forced herself to focus. They needed to get out of here. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that the men would find them. The men were already close. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. "Luke, come here," Kara said, her voice soft but firm. Luke looked up from the corner, his eyes searching hers. He slowly stood up and padded over to her. Kara reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "We're going to have to move again, okay? But I need you to listen to me and I need you to stay close. Can you do that?" she asked. Luke nodded, his lips pressed tightly together. He wasn't scared of what was coming. He was scared of losing her. Kara could see it in his eyes. He knew the danger they were in, but he was more worried about her, about what might happen if they couldn't get away. "We'll be okay," Kara said, more to reassure herself than him. She had to believe that. Kara stood and started to gather the maps, folding them with precision. She tucked them into her jacket pocket and quickly scanned the cabin. It wasn't much. A few old chairs, a table covered in dust, a wood stove that hadn't been used in years. But it was enough to offer them temporary shelter. For now, that was all they could ask for. Kara took one last look around the cabin before walking over to the door. She opened it a crack, peering out into the forest. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the terrain ahead, but the trees were still thick with shadow. There was no sign of the men, yet. She closed the door quietly, turning back to Luke. "We have to keep moving, sweetheart. You ready?" Luke didn't answer immediately, his gaze still locked on the door. He was holding something back, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "Hey," Kara said, kneeling down in front of him. "Whatever happens, we stick together. No matter what, we keep going. Okay?" Luke looked up at her, his eyes filled with unspoken emotions. For a brief moment his usual bravery faltered, but then, as if to reassure himself as much as her, he nodded. "Okay, Mom. I trust you." Kara hugged him tightly, the weight of their situation pressing down on her chest. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running. She didn't know if she could keep him safe, but she would die trying. After a long moment, Kara stood up and retrieved her rifle. She checked it again, making sure it was loaded and ready. She'd trained for this, every scenario, every possible outcome. But the truth was, there were some things you couldn't plan for. The men hunting them were unpredictable, they were ruthless, and Kara wasn't sure how much longer they could outrun them. "Stay close," Kara said, her voice steady. "We're heading for the hills. If we can make it through the ridge, there's a small town a few miles beyond. We can get there, find help." Luke nodded, his face a mask of determination. Kara opened the door again, stepping into the dense forest. She motioned for Luke to follow, keeping one hand on her rifle, her senses alert to every sound in the woods. They moved quickly, slipping through the underbrush, their footsteps barely a whisper against the ground. They didn't speak as they walked, there was no need. They knew what was at stake. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a bond forged by the danger that surrounded them. The woods were dense, the trees towering above them, blocking most of the daylight. Kara kept a steady pace, knowing they needed to get as far away from the cabin as possible before the men realized they had moved on. As they neared the ridge, Kara's nerves began to fray. She could feel the weight of every step, every moment of silence between them. They had been running for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Kara knew they couldn't stop for long. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. Suddenly, a rustle from behind them stopped her dead in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat. Had they been found? She immediately signaled for Luke to crouch low, hiding them both in the shadows of the trees. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she waited, listening for any signs of movement. The rustling came again, closer this time. Kara's grip tightened on her rifle, and she prepared herself for whatever was coming. She had trained for this moment. She knew how to survive, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the terror of knowing that her son's life was on the line. She took a deep breath, preparing to take action. She couldn't let fear control her. "Stay quiet, Luke," she whispered. Luke nodded and crouched down beside her, his small body trembling with fear. Kara peeked through the foliage, trying to get a glimpse of what was causing the noise. There, through the trees, she saw the flash of a flashlight, then another. The men were closer than she thought. Kara's breath caught in her throat as she watched the flashlights bobbing in the distance, moving closer. They were here. The men had found their trail. Her pulse quickened. Every instinct she had as a Green Beret flared to life. The training, the experience, the countless missions, they all surged through her. She couldn't let panic take over. "Stay calm, stay sharp." She turned to Luke, crouching low beside her. His eyes were wide with fear, but his expression was resolute. He was ready to follow her lead. She could see it in the way he held his breath, in the way his little hands clenched together. "Listen to me, Luke," Kara whispered urgently. "We have to stay still. We can't move until they pass. Do you understand?" Luke nodded, but Kara could feel the weight of his anxiety. He didn't want to stay still. He wanted to run, but that would only get them caught. Kara reached into her bag, pulling out a small but powerful flashlight, the kind that could be used to signal or disorient someone temporarily. She pointed it at the ground for a moment, silently communicating her plan to Luke. "When I say go, we run, but only when they're distracted." She turned her attention back to the men. 2 flashlights, 2 men. They were methodical, scanning the area, their voices low but intense. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but their search was becoming more frantic. The rustling in the trees grew louder. The men were moving closer. Kara's heart raced, but her body remained frozen, every fiber of her being focused on staying silent, staying hidden. She strained her ears, listening intently to their movements, trying to gauge where they were. This wasn't just about survival. It was about keeping Luke safe. The flashlights moved a little to the left. Kara's eyes flicked to the right, spotting a narrow gap between the trees that could lead them further into the hills. It wasn't much, but it was their best shot. She grabbed Luke's hand, giving him a firm, silent squeeze. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear but also with trust. "On my mark," Kara mouthed, her lips barely moving. Luke nodded, his small face set with determination. She checked the area one last time. The flashlights had moved further away, just far enough to give them a window of escape. Her breath slowed and her focus sharpened. This was their moment. "Go!" Kara whispered sharply. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Luke's hand and pulled him toward the gap in the trees, her feet moving silently through the underbrush. They darted between the thick trunks, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Behind them, the flashlights flickered in the distance, then stopped. A shouted command, too far for Kara to make out, echoed through the trees. The men had realized they were gone. Kara's adrenaline spiked. "Run! Keep running!" They moved fast, but not too fast. Kara knew better than to break into a full sprint. It would make them too visible. They needed to keep their movements controlled, their escape methodical. Luke was breathing heavily beside her, but he didn't complain. He was tough. They crept up the side of the hill, using the terrain to their advantage. The rise in the landscape offered them some cover. Kara paused for a moment, listening for any sounds behind them. Nothing. The forest felt still, too still. Kara turned to Luke, crouching, her down next to him. He was sweating, his face pale but determined. "You doing okay?" Luke nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'm fine, Mum, just keep going." Kara gave him a tight smile, proud of his courage. "We'll keep moving until we're out of their reach, okay?" Luke didn't say anything, but she could see that he was trying to stay calm, trying to hold it together. She hated that he had to grow up so quickly, but there was no time to dwell on that now. They kept moving upward, towards the ridge. Kara had been up here before, and while it was rough terrain, it was the best path to get them out of immediate danger. If they could get to the top of the ridge, there was a small network of caves they could hide in, but just as they were about to crest the hill, a voice rang out through the trees, loud and clear. "There they are." Kara's heart stopped. The men were close. Too close. She whipped around, pulling Luke to the ground behind a thick cluster of bushes. Her mind raced. There was no time to panic, no time to think about how close they were to being caught. Plan B. She crouched low, keeping her breathing shallow as she peered through the bushes. The 2 men were descending the hill, moving fast. They were within range now. She had seconds before they passed within shooting distance. Kara steadied herself, taking a deep breath. This wasn't the time to hesitate. Her Green Beret training kicked in. She could take them down silently and swiftly. She had the advantage. She knew the terrain better, and she knew how to use it to her advantage. But then a horrifying thought struck her. What if there were more? She glanced at Luke, who was staring up at her, his wide eyes filled with fear but trusting her implicitly. He didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but he knew that she would do whatever it took to keep him safe. Kara knew that they couldn't stay here much longer. The men were getting closer, and if she didn't act soon, they'd have no way out. She needed to make a decision fast. She turned to Luke one last time, whispering, "Stay down, do not make a sound." Kara's heartbeat was deafening in her ears, every muscle in her body primed and ready to act. She could hear the men's voices now just beyond the trees. They were getting closer. Too close. The gap between them was small, but enough for Kara to make a move if she timed it perfectly. She had been in worse situations before, but never with Luke in danger. This time the stakes were personal. She glanced down at her son, who was pressed flat against the ground, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His fear was palpable, but his resolve matched hers. She was determined to protect him no matter what. He needed her more than ever. Kara took one last, steadying breath and reached for her rifle. Her fingers slid over the cold metal, grounding her in the moment. Focus. She would have to be quick, decisive. No second chances. The men were talking now, their voices cutting through the silence of the forest like a blade. They were getting closer. She counted silently in her head. 5, 4, 3, 2. Kara sprang to her feet, moving faster than a heartbeat. In one smooth motion, she aimed her rifle at the first man. She didn't hesitate. Her finger pressed the trigger, sending a single shot through the air. The man dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the ground without a sound. His flashlight fell, rolling into the underbrush, its beam flickering and fading out. The second man froze, eyes wide, with shock. He had no idea what just happened, but he knew danger was near. Without thinking, he turned to flee, but Kara was already one step ahead. She shifted her aim, targeting the second man's leg. The shot rang out, hitting him squarely in the thigh. The man screamed, falling to the ground in pain. He tried to crawl, dragging himself through the dirt, but the wound was enough to slow him down significantly. He wouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon. Kara immediately dropped back into the underbrush, pulling Luke with her. "We need to move now," she whispered urgently, her voice low and sharp. There was no time to waste. The men might have been taken out for the moment, but there were others. More of them were bound to be close by, and Kara wasn't going to take any chances. She grabbed Luke's hand, pulling him up the hill toward the cave system she had spotted earlier. They moved quickly but silently. The ridge was steep and the terrain was unforgiving, but Kara knew it well. She had trained here before many years ago. The caves would offer them the cover they needed. As they neared the top of the hill, Kara's thoughts raced. How many were there? Where were the rest of the men? Was this the right decision? Luke stayed close behind her, his small footsteps quiet but determined. He didn't ask questions, didn't look back. He trusted her. When they reached the top of the ridge, Kara crouched down to survey the area. The fog had begun to settle again, shrouding the landscape in an eerie grey mist. But the caves were just ahead. She could see the jagged entrance in the distance. "Stay low," Kara whispered, pulling Luke to the ground with her. They crawled the final few feet to the cave, careful to stay out of sight. Kara slipped inside first, making sure to clear the area before motioning for Luke to follow. The cave was narrow, the air damp and cool. It smelled of earth and moss, but it would provide the cover they needed. As soon as they were both inside, Kara pressed her back against the stone wall, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, but there was no time to slow down. She turned to Luke, who was huddled against her, his face pale but focused. "We're safe for now," she whispered. "But we can't stay here long. We have to keep moving." Luke nodded, his hand still gripping hers tightly. Kara checked her watch. They'd been moving for hours now, and the men would not give up easily. But they had to rest. They couldn't afford to push on without a plan. Kara leaned back against the cave wall, listening for any signs of movement outside. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, but the adrenaline was still coursing through her veins. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. It wasn't until she saw Luke start to drift off to sleep, his head resting against her shoulder, that Kara allowed herself a moment to breathe. Just a moment of peace. But even as the stillness of the cave surrounded them, Kara knew this was far from over. The men would be out there. They would be looking for them, hunting them down. and the next time Kara wouldn't be able to afford any mistakes. Kara sat in the dim light of the cave, listening to the soft rhythm of Luke's breathing as he slept beside her. The weight of the silence pressed down on her, but she knew better than to let her guard down. This was the calm before the storm, and she had to stay alert. Her mind kept replaying the last few moments, her shots, the men she'd taken down. It was all so fluid, so instinctive. She had done what she had to do, but there was no room for victory in her mind, only the next move. She couldn't afford to get comfortable. Not yet. Not until they were out of danger. Kara glanced at Luke, his face soft in sleep. He looked so young, so innocent in this moment. But deep down, she knew he was tougher than most kids his age. He had already seen too much, and she hated that. She hated that he had to grow up in a world like this, but she had no choice. She would protect him with her life. She stood up quietly, stretching her sore muscles, then checked the entrance to the cave. The fog still lingered outside, wrapping the forest in a grey shroud that could either hide them or betray them. Kara scanned the surrounding woods. Nothing, no movement. The men had to be getting close. It had been too long since the gunshots. She crouched down next to Luke, shaking him gently. "Luke, wake up." His eyes fluttered open, confusion briefly crossing his face before recognition set in. "Are they still out there?" he asked, his voice hoarse from sleep. Kara nodded. "They're still out there, but we're safe for now." Luke sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. "What do we do now?" Kara's gaze hardened as she thought about their next steps. She couldn't keep running. Sooner or later the men would corner them, and she wouldn't have the luxury of time. She needed a plan that gave them a chance to fight back. "We need to get back to the cabin. They'll think we're still running, but if we can trap them there, we can use the terrain to our advantage," Kara said, her voice low and steady. Luke frowned, his brow furrowed. "But what if there's more of them? What if we don't make it?" Kara smiled softly, cupping his face with one hand. "We'll make it. We just need to stick together and trust each other. We'll find a way." Then a shadow appeared in the fog. One more. She didn't hesitate. Her rifle was already in her hands, the barrel steady as she peered through the scope. The silhouette was unmistakable. A man, moving cautiously but quickly, probably on the lookout for any sign of movement. Her finger hovered over the trigger. One shot. Kara exhaled slowly, aligning her sights. The figure moved closer, oblivious to her position. She knew it was now or never. The sound of the shot was deafening, the crack of the rifle echoing through the forest. The man's body jerked, then dropped to the ground. Kara's grip tightened on the rifle as she quickly scanned for any other threats. One down, but there could be more. "Stay low," Kara hissed to Luke, pulling him further into the brush. She needed to keep them concealed, to get to the creek where they'd have a better chance of escaping unnoticed. But time was running out. The noise from the shot would attract the others. Luke nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and understanding. His small hand gripped hers tighter. They moved fast, weaving through the trees. Kara's senses heightened to the smallest sound. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every gust of wind in the branches above was a potential threat. Just as they neared the creek, Kara's heart skipped. She heard more voices, loud, angry voices. They were coming. The footsteps were too close, too fast. Kara froze, her eyes darting around, looking for the nearest cover. There was no time for a full plan. They had to run, and they had to do it now. "Luke," Kara said urgently, keeping her voice low. "We're going to move fast. All right? Just follow me. Don't stop running until we're in the water, understand?" Luke nodded, his face pale but resolute. Kara counted down in her head. 1, 2, 3. With a sharp inhale, she grabbed Luke's hand and broke into a sprint, moving low and fast. She couldn't risk making noise. She had to stay out of sight. The creek wasn't far now, but they were exposed. Every second counted. The sounds of pursuit followed them, closer with each passing moment. Kara's breath came in ragged bursts, but she forced herself to focus. They had to get to the water. The creek would hide their tracks, give them the cover they desperately needed. But just as she thought they might make it, She heard a twig snap behind them. They weren't alone anymore. Kara pushed Luke ahead of her, her heart pounding as she turned to face the sound. There, one of the men was closing in on them, his silhouette emerging from the fog. He had a rifle, and it was pointed right at them. Kara's mind raced. I can't let him shoot. She dove behind a large boulder, pulling Luke down with her just as the man raised his rifle. The bullet whizzed past them, missing by inches. Kara's mind went into overdrive. Think. She couldn't shoot. Not like this. Not with Luke right next to her, but the man didn't see where they'd gone. The rock had given them a moment of cover, but it wouldn't last long. Stay quiet, Luke, Kara whispered, her hand firmly clutching his. She looked over her shoulder, searching for any sign of the enemy. The footsteps stopped. He was looking for them. Kara held her breath, praying he wouldn't find them. She'd been trained for this, but facing it in real life was different. The stakes were higher. Luke's life was on the line. The man was only a few feet away now, creeping through the trees, his rifle still in hand. Kara knew what she had to do. She wouldn't wait for him to get any closer. She couldn't afford to. She squeezed Luke's hand and in one swift motion sprang from her hiding spot, sprinting toward the creek, dragging Luke behind her. The man's shout came too late. The rifle crackled once again, but this time Kara was already moving. They were almost there. They'd make it. They had to. Kara's lungs burned as she ran, her legs pumping hard beneath her. The creek was so close she could almost taste the cool water. But with every step, the sound of pursuit behind them grew louder, closer, more relentless. She barely had time to think. Her body moved on instinct, each footfall a desperate attempt to outrun the enemy, closing in on them. Luke, clutching her, hand with everything he had, kept up as best as he could, but his small frame wasn't built for running like this. Faster, sweetheart, Kara urged, her voice low but firm. We're almost there. Luke's breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't hesitate. He ran beside her, his fear now focused solely on the mission ahead, getting to that creek. They burst through the underbrush just as the creek came into view. The sound of rushing water was a sweet relief in the midst of the chaos, but there was no time to stop, no time to rest. Stay close, Kara hissed, pulling him to the water's edge. The current was swift, but not unmanageable. She didn't have time to second-guess herself. She yanked off her boots and motioned for Luke to do the same. Mom, we have to hide, Luke whispered, his eyes wide as he glanced nervously around. We will, Kara promised, but she knew they couldn't hide here for long. The creek would give them a small window of safety, but if the men were still tracking them, they wouldn't have long. Kara stepped into the water, feeling the cold rush up around her ankles. She winced but pushed forward. The water would mask their scent, and it would make it harder for the men to follow their trail. She tugged Luke in beside her, keeping him close to her side. They waded carefully through the shallow water, moving against the current as quickly as possible. The rocks beneath their feet were slick and dangerous, but Kara wasn't about to let that slow them down. The sound of running water drowned out all other noise, but Kara's ears were still tuned to the soft sounds of the forest. She heard something, a snap of a branch, the faintest rustling, and her heart skipped. Mom, Luke whispered, his voice a tremor of fear. Kara's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. Quiet, she hissed, her voice deadly calm despite the surge of panic inside her. The seconds felt like minutes. She held her breath, listening for anything that would give them away. Then, the sound came. A man's voice, one of the pursuers, had found the tracks at the edge of the creek. They were closer than she had expected. We've got them, the voice said, rough and low. They're in the creek. Go upstream. I'll take the downstream. Kara's heart pounded. No time. They were splitting up. That meant they had to move faster before they were trapped between the two men. She turned to Luke, her eyes hard. We're going to keep moving, she said, her voice tight. Stay low and don't make a sound, understand? Luke nodded, his face pale but determined. They moved faster now, the current making it harder to stay balanced. Kara gritted, her teeth and focused on putting one foot in front of the other, fighting the surge of panic, threatening to claw its way up from her gut. They couldn't get caught. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. Ahead, the creek curved around. A bend, thick trees forming a wall on either side. There was a small cove of trees just ahead. If they could make it there, they could hide and regroup. Kara pushed forward, keeping her eyes locked on the cove, trying to shut out the sound of the men's voices in the distance. She could still hear them talking, their voices carrying over the water. "Mom, I can't," Luke gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Kara stopped immediately, turning to kneel beside him. "What is it? What's wrong?" Luke's small face was flushed with exhaustion. He was struggling to keep up, and Kara could see the weight of fear in his eyes. "I'm scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Kara's heart broke for him. She reached out and cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. "I know, baby, but we're almost there. We're almost safe. Can you keep going? Can you do it for me?" Luke nodded slowly, his small chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. "Good," Kara said, brushing his hair back from his face. "You're doing great. Now let's get to the trees. Just a little further." They kept moving. Kara could feel the weight of every step, every breath, but she pushed it all aside, not for her. She wasn't going to stop until they were safe. They made it to the cove just as the first man came into view upstream. Kara quickly pulled Luke behind the thick trunks of 2 trees, crouching low. She watched through the branches, trying to keep her breathing steady. The man moved past them, not noticing their presence. Kara's heart was in her throat as he passed mere feet from where they hid. She barely dared to breathe, every muscle in her body tensed, ready to react if needed. The man stopped briefly, listening to the rush of the water. Kara's pulse quickened, but she stayed frozen. Luke was pressed against her, so close she could feel the tremble of his body. Finally, the man moved on, heading downstream. Kara waited until she couldn't hear him anymore before she exhaled sharply, her heart still racing. She gently lifted Luke, and they continued through the trees, moving silently in the shadows. Kara's thoughts raced ahead. What if there were more? What if they had missed something? She couldn't afford to make another mistake, but for now they had made it this far. They had a chance, just a little longer. Kara's heart thudded in her chest as she and Luke slipped deeper into the cover of the trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting long, jagged shadows on the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves, and every rustle of the branches above them felt like it could be a warning. They'd made it this far, but Kara knew they weren't safe yet. The men were still out there, hunting them down like animals. The sound of footsteps, distant but still too close for comfort, echoed from behind them. They couldn't stay in one place for long. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. "Keep quiet," Kara whispered to Luke, squeezing his hand. His small body was shaking against hers, but he held on with surprising strength. Kara's heart swelled with pride. Even though the situation was grim, they continued moving, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches or rustling too loudly in the underbrush. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and right now they were the mice. The men were predators, but Kara was determined not to be caught. They approached a dense thicket of bushes, the thick foliage providing a natural barrier. Kara made a quick decision. It wasn't much, but it was better than the wide-open space they'd just crossed. "Over here," she hissed, pulling Luke into the bushes with her. The moment they were hidden, Kara crouched down low, her back pressed against the rough bark of a nearby tree. Luke followed her lead, his eyes wide as he peered through the leaves, watching for any signs of movement. Kara's breath slowed as she listened intently, straining to hear the sounds of the men behind them. The crackling of the underbrush grew louder, and Kara could feel her pulse quicken. They were getting closer. She checked her watch quickly. 5 minutes. If they could just hold out for 5 more minutes, they might be able to make a run for it to the nearby farmhouse. She had scouted the place before the attack. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance they had to get somewhere more secure. Kara scanned the area around them, looking for any signs of movement. The last thing she wanted was to be caught off guard. Her eyes darted from the bushes to the trees, but all she saw was the dark, quiet forest. Then, a branch snapped to the left. Kara's heart stopped. "Did you hear that?" Luke whispered, his voice trembling. Kara nodded, her instincts kicking into high gear. She motioned for Luke to stay still and be as quiet as possible. One wrong move and they were done for. She carefully peered through the bushes, spotting a figure moving in the distance. It was one of the men, his figure outlined by the faint moonlight. He was walking toward them, methodically searching, his rifle held tight in his hands. Kara's breath hitched. She had no way of knowing if he had heard them or was just in the vicinity. But she couldn't take any chances. She pulled Luke closer, her arm wrapped protectively around him. No noise, not a sound. The man moved closer. Kara could see the way. He scanned the trees, his head swiveling as he took slow, deliberate steps. If he came any closer, he'd be able to see them. Kara's mind raced. There was no way out of this without taking action. They were running out of time. The man stopped right at the edge of their hiding place. Kara held her breath, her heart in her throat. She could see the faint outline of his figure through the branches. He was so close she could hear his breathing, shallow and ragged, as he too listened for any sign of movement. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Then the man took a step forward, his boot crunching on a dried twig. Kara's heart nearly leaped out of her chest. They were done for. Without thinking, she grabbed Luke's arm and pulled him down lower into the brush, trying to make herself as small as possible. She barely managed to hold her breath as the man continued forward, but then, just as it seemed like the man was about to step right on top of them, he suddenly paused. Something in the distance caught his attention. His head snapped to the side, and Kara had only a split second to react. Now. Without hesitating, Kara bolted forward, her hand pulling Luke with her. They tore through the brush, the sound of footsteps behind them urging them on. They had to move fast. No more second chances. Kara's legs burned as they sprinted through the forest, the crackle of branches beneath their feet almost drowned out by the pounding of her heart. Luke struggled to keep up, but Kara kept him close, urging him on with every step. They had to make it to the farmhouse. It was the only place where they might be able to hide, to rest, and to think. Suddenly, she heard shouts from behind them. The men had spotted them. Kara's pulse quickened. They were too close. She glanced ahead, seeing the faint outline of the farmhouse in the distance. They were almost there, but they weren't going to make it unless they moved faster. "Come." "On, Luke," Kara urged, her voice hoarse with fear. Almost there. She could hear the men's footsteps growing closer, but she pushed herself harder, not allowing herself to slow down for even a moment. The farmhouse was only a few yards away now, just a little farther. Then, suddenly, as if the world had been holding its breath, she saw the front door of the farmhouse swing open. "Over here," a voice called. Kara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Luke's hand and pulled him forward, running with every ounce of strength she had left. The men were too close for comfort. They were almost there. Kara and Luke sprinted toward the farmhouse, their lungs burning and legs aching with every step. The door that had swung open just moments ago was now the only thing standing between them and safety. The voice calling out to them was urgent, but the sound of heavy footsteps behind them reminded Kara that they weren't out of danger yet. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Two of the men were in pursuit and they were gaining ground. She pushed Luke forward, her grip firm but gentle. "Go! Go! Go!" she urged, not even pausing to catch her breath. The farmhouse door was wide, open now, and Kara saw a figure standing in the doorway. A man, broad-shouldered and strong, his eyes sharp. "Inside, quickly," he barked, his voice commanding. Without hesitation, Kara and Luke charged through the door, with the man stepping aside to let them pass. Before the door slammed shut, Kara heard the sounds of footsteps pounding after them. They weren't going to be safe for long. Not as long. As those men were still out there, the man in the doorway immediately bolted the door, locking it tight. Kara barely noticed as she turned to find a safe spot to regroup. "Mom," Luke said, tugging on her sleeve. He was panting, sweat dripping down his face, but his voice was still full of fear. "We're safe for now, sweetie," Kara said, though her own heart was racing. The farmhouse wasn't safe forever. She had to think. They needed to regroup, prepare for what came next. The man who had helped them was still standing near the door, his posture tense, eyes scanning the room. His clothes were worn but functional. Combat boots, cargo pants, a simple shirt, and he looked like someone who had seen more than his fair share of danger. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, but his gaze never left the door. Kara nodded, quickly catching her breath. For now, we're safe, but they'll be back. The man, who had not yet introduced himself, nodded grimly. Name's Jake. You're lucky I was home tonight. Kara took a moment to breathe, glancing around the farmhouse. The interior was rustic, but it had everything they needed: sturdy walls, a fireplace for warmth, and most importantly, a place to hide. Do you have a way to defend yourself? Kara asked quickly, her mind already racing with the next steps. Jake's lips twisted into a grim smile. I'm no stranger to a fight. What's your plan? Kara turned to Luke, who was now huddled close to her side. Her heart swelled with pride at how brave he was, even though he was scared. We're not safe here for long, Kara said, her voice firm. Those men will come back, they know we're here, and if they're anything like I think they are, they won't stop until they've found us. Jake nodded, understanding the situation immediately. Then we'll make our stand here. They won't get through that door easily, and we'll be ready for them. Kara knew that standing their ground was their only option. They couldn't outrun these men any longer. They had to fight. Jake moved swiftly across the room, pulling a rifle from a rack mounted on the wall. He checked the magazine, then handed it to Kara. You know how to use this? Kara took the rifle without hesitation, her hand steady as she examined it. I've used a few in my time, she said with a grim smile. She wasn't about to let anyone, especially not these men, take her son away from her. Luke, though shaken, stood by her side, his eyes wide but determined. He had seen his mother fight before, but he had never seen her face such a challenge. She knew this fight would be different, but she wouldn't back down. We'll set up some defenses, Jake said, moving to the windows. He pulled out a pair of binoculars and scanned the surrounding area. They'll likely try to flank us. We'll need to watch all angles. Kara followed his movements, her mind working in overdrive. Every decision she made now would determine their survival. Luke, stay close, she said, crouching down to his level. I need you to be quiet, okay? And do exactly what I say, no matter what happens. Luke nodded quickly, his small face set in a look of grim resolve. He was scared, but he trusted her. He always trusted her. We're going to be okay, Kara said softly, brushing his hair out of his face. She needed him to believe her. She needed to believe it too. Jake moved toward the back of the house. I'll go check the perimeter, he said. You two stay here. If they come through that door, we fight. Kara nodded, her grip tightening around the rifle. She wasn't afraid anymore. Her training, her instincts, they were all kicking. And she wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a fighter, and she would protect her son at any cost. As Jake left the room, Kara knelt by the window, her eyes scanning the yard outside. The night was quiet for now, but the danger was palpable. They were coming. She could feel it in her bones. Luke stayed by her side, clutching her hand tightly. He didn't speak, but his presence gave Kara the strength she needed. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, before the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Kara's heart raced again, her fingers tightening around the rifle. She was ready. The air inside the farmhouse turned electric. The soft creak of floorboards, the rustling wind outside. It all fell away as Kara focused on one sound: boots in the dirt. They were coming. She exchanged a look with Luke, his small hand still clutched in hers, and nodded to Jake, who had just returned from the back of the house, rifle slung across his chest. They're circling, Jake said, ducking low beneath the window frame. 5, maybe 6 of them. Armed. They're trying to flush us out. Kara gave a tight nod, mind sharp and heart steady. This was it. The last fight. Luke squeezed her hand again. His eyes, though scared, were steady. Are we going to be okay? Mom? Kara knelt beside him, touching her forehead to his. We're going to do everything we can, but I need you to stay right here, no matter what happens. Don't move until I tell you. Can you do that for me? Luke nodded silently. She could see his courage swelling through the fear. Jake motioned her toward the front. We take the front. I've got claymores rigged at the east window and tripwire on the back door. But the front's the only way they'll come if they want a clean shot. Kara's hands moved like muscle memory, checking the rifle, chambering around. Let's make it a mess then. The two warriors took position, the farmhouse dimly lit, the windows covered with tattered curtains. Outside, flashlights flicked through the trees like ghosts searching for souls. The men were trying to intimidate them, slow play the assault. Kara wasn't interested in waiting. One of the flashlights paused, just beyond the porch. Then, a voice called out, "You've got one chance. Give us the kid, and you both walk away." Kara's jaw clenched. She stepped toward the door, rifle at the ready, then raised her voice through the wood. "You picked the wrong mother." Silence. Then gunfire. The first bullet ripped through the window, missing Kara by inches. Jake returned fire instantly, ducking. Behind the fireplace, as Kara dove behind the overturned kitchen table they'd set as cover. Glass shattered, wood splintered. The night exploded. Luke was curled up behind the couch, hands over his ears, just like Kara had told him. Every instinct in her body screamed to run to him, but she knew staying in position was the only way to keep him safe. Kara popped up, fired 2 rounds, center mass, at the man trying to breach the porch. He dropped instantly. 4 more. Jake shouted from across the room. Kara reloaded without hesitation, moving like she'd done this 1,000 times because she had. War zones, jungle clearances, covert missions, nothing had prepared her like motherhood had. The stakes were personal now. More shots rang out. The claymore Jake had planted went off, boom, lighting up the night with a thunderous crack. A scream followed. 3, Kara called out, scanning through the broken window. They came in. Fast, reckless now. One tried to come through the back, mistake. The tripwire triggered, sending a blast of shrapnel that tore through the wooden frame. Silence. 2, Jake growled, moving to flank the remaining men. Kara crouched low, crept to the front door and swung it open wide. The last 2 men stood frozen in the yard, clearly rethinking everything. One of them bolted into the woods. The other raised his weapon, too slow. Kara dropped him in one shot. Clean. The quiet returned. Not peaceful, not yet, but quiet. Jake walked back into the house, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle. "You weren't kidding," he said, surveying the damage. "Green Beret." Kara exhaled, her shoulders finally dropping. "Sniper team leader, 3rd Battalion, but that was a long time ago." Jake gave a low whistle. "You've still got it?" She didn't answer. She just walked to the couch, dropped her rifle, and fell to her knees in front of Luke, who threw his arms around her the second she touched him. "You did so good, baby," Kara whispered, hugging him tight. "It's over. We're okay." Jake gave them space, glancing out the window with one hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm. "You think they'll come back?" he asked after a long moment. Kara looked up, eyes sharp. "Not if they know what's good for them." Outside, the night was still again. Smoke lingered in the air, but the storm had passed. They'd survived, and more than that, they had won. Kara stood slowly, lifting Luke in her arms, pressing a kiss to his forehead. This farmhouse wasn't just a home anymore. It was the place they reclaimed their lives, the place where fear ended and strength took its place. As she stepped outside, holding her son, the stars above the farm burned bright. Not a sign of threat in sight, only the sound of crickets and the distant cry of a barn owl in the trees. She turned to Jake. "Thanks for having our back." Jake shrugged. "Any time," she smiled. "Let's clean this place up. I have a feeling this is going to be home for a while." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?